to meet the court. Every time they have a change in membership, they take a new photo. And part of why I like to show you this is not only to introduce you to the various justices, but because this really embodies the way that the Supreme Court embraces traditions, ritual, and are very concerned about seniority. So in the middle, prime of place is going to be Chief Justice Roberts. Then we're going to go out based on seniority. So those that have been on the court the longest are going to get those right and left seats by him. So we have Thomas and Breyer, further out Sotomayor and Alito. Then we go back to more recent judges with Gorsuch and Kagan, and then of course Kavanaugh and Corey Barrett, sorry, I can't get that out, who we just very recently added to the court. Okay, so Article 3 of the US Constitution creates the judicial branch, and it states that the judicial branch should consist of, quote, the Supreme Court and such inferior courts as Congress from time to time established. The Judiciary Act was Congress's first attempt to do just that, establishing a federal court system. So it establishes the role of Chief Justice and Associate Justices. Originally, there were 5 Associate Justices and then the 1 Chief Justice. They found out they were having a lot of decisions that ended in ties, so decided they needed an odd number. Now there are 8 Associates and 1 Chief Justice. Congress can, because it doesn't specify in the Judiciary Act how many Associate Justices, it is possible to add more, basically for Congress to add more. Used to be conventional wisdom, that would never happen. It's been 9 for well over 100 years now. And as we'll see in the nominations documentary that you're gonna watch, the court has gone through some real politicization. And so there has been a recent push to talk about court packing and talk about that maybe because they have lifetime tenure, that the current administration should add more justices. Judiciary Act also set up the tripartite system, as in 3 parts of district and court and circuit courts. It's been greatly expanded since that time period, but we still have that same level. So you have US district courts on the lowest level. They appeal up to the circuit courts, then up to the Supreme Court at the top. There was also originally the Supreme Court would what's called ride circuit, where they would travel and hear cases in the lower circuit courts. That hasn't happened for a while now. This is how it looks now with our various districts. And we'll revisit the Judiciary Act of 1789 when we discuss Marbury versus Madison. But just know for now that this sets up a system in which federal cases start off in these district courts. So there is this need to appeal cases up and up. So circuit court, you don't get the answer you want, you can appeal it up to the district court. District court to circuit court, then potentially the Supreme Court. Now the Supreme Court accepts less than 2% of cases that are sent to them and asked to be heard. As a result, most of the lower court decisions remain. So it is incredibly important to see what's happening in these 10 circuits, as that's often going to remain the law of the land. There was claims a couple of years ago about how certain lower courts were getting overturned by high percentages, and that's actually not the case. In 99.5% of lower cases, the decision stands. What happens is the court takes those few cases that they feel like they might want to overthrow. So if you make it to the Supreme Court, there's a good chance that they are unhappy with the lower court decision. The low acceptance rate, this less than 2%, is not entirely the fault of the courts. There are constitutional restrictions on which cases, as well as their own sort of selection process. But in terms of actual restrictions, the first is jurisdiction. Do they have the jurisdiction to hear the case? They basically have to stay in their lane. So what cases are they able to hear? Original means it goes straight to the Supreme Court. An example of this is when one state sues another. We're going to talk more about this with Marbury versus Madison, an attempted expansion of that power. Much more common path is through appeal process. So where you are going through the lower courts, appealing that decision all the way up. So that's appellate jurisdiction. Now, we discussed the path among the federal courts, right? That idea of district to circuit, hopefully the Supreme Court. In state courts, you also have to go through that appellate process. States have different names for their top court. Some call them Superior Court, others Supreme Court. But there's always that notion that there is that top level of the court of last resort in the state systems. Can't jump the line. You can't try to go up to the higher court right away. You can't go to the Supreme Court right away. You have to go through that appellate process. So going through each level of that system. Also, the Supreme Court can say, hey, we want that case. They have to wait for it to get to them. And of course, they may not, in fact, accept this. Okay, so it's within their jurisdiction. In addition, the person bringing the case must have standing to sue. Standing, the issue is real. The party bringing the case is the one that was affected by it. Can't just go challenging some law because you think it's unconstitutional, because you don't like it. If it hasn't affected your life, they're not allowed to hear the case. So first of all, the idea of the party having suffered some injury. Were you personally harmed by this law or policy? Have you suffered an injury, or are you in imminent danger of suffering an injury? Now, an example of this where the party had not suffered an injury and therefore was denied standing was in the Hollingsworth v. Perry case. This is the case dealing with California Prop 8 that amended the California Constitution to disallow same-sex marriage. The couples that originally brought the case was a lesbian and a gay couple, and so they had standing to sue. They'd been injured by this prop. When it got to the Supreme Court, however, the state officials who were named in this case, they're like, yeah, actually, we're not going to defend this law. We don't believe in it, basically. And so the people who had been behind passing the proposition asked to step in as the defendant. So they became the defendants in this case. The Supreme Court said, no, you don't have standing to sue. We get you don't want same-sex marriage to be a thing, but no one's denying you to get married. You have not suffered an injury. You just don't like this law, basically. Now, a second aspect of this is that the injury must be fairly traceable to the challenged action law. Maybe you were jailed as a result of this law. Maybe you didn't get unemployment benefits because you were smoking peyote. We will talk about that case. Maybe you're not allowed to get married because of Prop 8. For all of these, there is that link. You suffered an injury, and it's due to this law, policy, state action. Third, the party must show that a favorable court decision will likely prove redress. By that, I mean the court has the power to help. There is a judicial solution. For example, they can overturn the law. They can stay in action, which is kind of a different procedure we'll talk about later. Or are you asking for something beyond their power? They can't create law. They can only interpret existing law. So with this, there is actual standing. It's traceable to that policy, and the court has the ability to do something about it. Now, another consideration is ripeness. And it is what it sounds like. Is the fruit ripe enough to be picked by the Supreme Court? When something's seen as not ripe enough yet, one reason for that could be because you haven't gone through all the procedures yet. You haven't gone through the various processes where you can challenge something. This is we see this often in like school hearings. If you would have to go through whatever procedures were set out by that school before you could get to the point of an actual legal case that can be challenged. Secondly is that maybe it's just not imminent yet. So it's not about to happen. It may not happen at all. We're not sure yet if this is really going to be a case. So in that waiting to see, will something come from this? On the flip side of that is mootness, where the issue at hand has already been resolved or it's changed, so that at that point the decision is just hypothetical, academic. Always say, go back to this, we are a real court of law. We're not a constitutional tribunal. Now, examples of this, for a long time, abortion cases were denied standing for this reason, because the woman would have had the baby by the time the case made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And they're like, we can't help you, it's already happened, right? So when we get to Roe, they allow Roe to stand in for all similarly situated women. Another example were affirmative action cases for universities. So in one case, by the time the case got to the Supreme Court, they were like, you already have a law degree. What, you want to go back and get another one from this other school? No, like you're already set. So at that point, the case is moot. Finally, is the case justiciable? Is it appropriate for judicial resolution? One aspect of this is case or controversy. Must be a real case. Again, the Supreme Court is a court of law. There have to be parties to the case, real issues, real conflicts. Now, this is in contrast to courts that give advisory opinions. The Supreme Court very early on said, we don't do that. You don't come to us just to ask us about our kind of constitutional beliefs. We have to have a real case. It's not about how abstract ideas. We're not giving advice to other branches. It has to be real and no collusion. And by that I mean you can't have two people who are in on it together. They want to like test the constitutionality of a law, so they set up a case, when in reality there's no true conflict there. They both have the same end goal. That has happened in history. There are some notable examples of that, but it's not supposed to happen because once again, it's not seen as a case or controversy. Also political questions. We talked about this in relation to Dworkin because he brings this up in his article, What is the Rule of Law? If the issue is primarily political, not legal, then it should be decided through political means, complete with democratic electoral accountability. So is the question an issue for one of the other branches? Is it more about making policy than determining these points of law or constitutionality? And here you see concerns about legitimacy. The court is supposed to be nonpartisan, above the fray. They interpret, they don't create laws. And a big place where we see this is in voting rights, and I believe I used this example before. On one side, you're protecting the sacred right of the vote. On the other side, you're deciding elections. Bush v. Gore was very much argued in this way. Were they in fact, ensuring one man, one vote, or did they decide the election by stopping the recount? Political question doctrine also comes up in redistricting cases with that idea of do they get involved in that? If you have one party has drawn these district lines that are in such a way as to ensure their own victory, are people being denied their vote and representation? Or if the court weighs in at that point goes into the political thicket, are they basically doing the job of the legislature, because it is the state legislatures that draw these lines, and you're also relying on the court to be able to do it well. So they're basically making policy at that point if they're redistricting. But then again, on the other side, if they're like, this is so problematic that all these people are being denied representation, that's going to be a constitutional issue. So always back to, is it political? Is it political? Is it constitutional? So just to give you an example of a case that is pulling from multiple of these. So again, this is just an example for you. Goldwater v. Carter. Senator Goldwater sued President Carter for terminating a defense treaty with Taiwan without notifying the Senate. Now, the Constitution, it's clear that the Senate has to consent to treaties. However, it says nothing about the termination of treaties. So in this comes into, is it unconstitutional for the president to terminate a treaty without the advice and consent of Congress? The majority of the justices did not feel that this was a case the court could hear, but they differed in their reasons as to why, and why I like to use this as an example. Justice Powell talked about ripeness. Issue is not ripe yet because the two sides haven't reached a constitutional impasse. They're still in discussions about it. They're still working through the problem. They may find a solution without the court, we don't know yet. In this idea too, his concern, it needs to be really serious before the court wades in and decides something between Congress and the president, which gets to his next point. This isn't all of Congress, this is some senators. So we aren't at the point of these two branches fighting over constitutional powers that we have to come in and make that decision. If it gets serious enough, though, however, he says if the whole Congress was questioning this, then, quote, in that situation, it would be the duty of the court to resolve the issue. Rehnquist, who is joined by Berger, Stewart, and Stevens, determined that the basic question presented is political, so the political question doctrine, therefore not justiciable. Can't be determined by the courts, can't be decided by the courts. Why? Because it involves the authority of the president in the conduct of foreign relations. Constitution does not talk about, does not specifically, it's not in the text of the Constitution, anything about termination of treaties. Therefore, it becomes a foreign policy issue, and the president has a great deal of leeway when it involves a foreign policy issue. So in this idea that for them to decide otherwise, to weigh in, was dealing with another branch that's electorally accountable. Now, Brennan in his dissent claims that Rehnquist misunderstands the political question doctrine. The court wasn't being asked to review the president's decision, only whether or not he had the constitutional authority to make that decision. So he writes, the issue of decision-making authority must be resolved as a matter of constitutional law, not political discretion. Accordingly, it falls within the competence of the courts. So very much back to that idea, is this constitutional or is it political? Is it constitutional or is it about what different branches should be doing? Always at issue in this doctrine, are they answering a constitutional question? In which case, definitely within their purview, they definitely have the jurisdiction, or are they resolving a potential political conflict? If political, should leave it to representatives, electorally accountable representatives, be that Congress or the president. Part of this is exactly because the court is the anti-majoritarian branch. They have no accountability, no democratic accountability. So it's incredibly important for them not to be wading into the political thicket. So these are limitations to when the court will hear a case, some self-imposed, but widely accepted. What else goes into the selection of cases, given that they decide not to accept over 98% of those they're asked to hear? That will be discussed in the next lecture.